Have you ever wondered what truly happened to the Maya disciples who failed the rituals their priests called sacred, but their oracles feared more than death itself? Imagine standing inside a stone chamber lit only by flickering torches, the air heavy with incense that burns the throat, while ancient priests trace symbols across your skin meant to bind your spirit to forces you barely understand. The Maya world was not built only on astronomy, mathematics, and grand pyramids. Beneath that, brilliance hid rituals so secret that only a handful of chosen disciples ever witnessed them, and fewer still survived the consequences of failure. Failure was not simply a mistake. Failure meant something inside you was broken beyond repair, something that threatened the balance the priests claimed to guard. The disciples who walked into these secluded temples were young, ambitious, and desperate to prove themselves worthy. They believed the rituals would elevate them, cleanse them, or grant them a place among the spiritual elite. But the moment they stepped into the sacred chamber, they entered a different world entirely, a world where silence became a weapon and shadows seemed to breathe. The priests stood watching from the gloom, their faces painted with charcoal and blood, their eyes fixed on even the slightest tremor of doubt. A single misstep, a wavering breath, a hesitation at the wrong moment could be interpreted as spiritual weakness. And weakness was the one thing the Maya priesthood believed must be punished without mercy. What shocks most people is not that the disciples were tested. It's the nature of those tests, the unspoken truth behind the rituals, and the brutal precision with which the priests responded to those who faltered. The Maya believed the universe was fragile, held together by the discipline of the chosen few. If a disciple failed, the priests claimed it was not their failure alone. It was a threat to cosmic order, a danger that had to be corrected in ways that even the oracles whispered about with trembling voices. This was not punishment for the body. It was punishment for the soul, and those who bore it carried marks no eye could see, but every spirit could feel. What you are about to discover challenges everything you thought you knew about ancient civilizations and their spiritual leaders. These rituals were not simply traditions, they were instruments of fear, crafted to ensure obedience and maintain the absolute power of the clergies who shaped entire kingdoms. And if any disciple dared to show fear, weakness, or hesitation, they were led into chambers where even the most loyal oracle would avert their eyes, unable to watch what came next. You may begin to sense why these stories were erased, hidden, or reinterpreted as myth. But the truth lingers in fragments, waiting to be pieced together. Before we go deeper, tell me what you think so far. Have you ever imagined ancient priests wielding this level of psychological control? Share your thoughts in the comments. It helps uncover how these forgotten stories still resonate today. And while you're here, make sure to like the video and check if you're already subscribed to the channel. Understanding this content fully is part of keeping these lost histories alive. Now hold on to that feeling, because what comes next pushes us further into the chambers where failure became fate and obedience was written in blood. The disciples who stepped beyond that first threshold entered a world intentionally designed to strip away any illusions of safety. The Maya priests understood that true submission began long before the rituals themselves. It began in the selection process, where young candidates were observed from childhood, chosen not for their strength alone, but for their susceptibility to spiritual influence. Families considered it an honor to offer a child, never realizing that the selection was less about potential and more about vulnerability. The priests watched how a child reacted to isolation, to hunger, to fear. Those who held themselves together too firmly who possessed a will too strong, were quietly dismissed. The ones who trembled, who hesitated, who broke under pressure but kept trying, those were the ones they sought. They believed such souls could be reshaped like soft clay. When a disciple was chosen, the true transformation began. From the moment they entered the priestly compounds, they were cut off from family, stripped of personal identity, and immersed in teachings that blurred the boundaries between devotion and submission. The priests trained them in silence first, not as discipline, but as a way to soften the mind. Days passed without a spoken word. The only sounds were footsteps echoing through stone corridors and distant drums marking the passage of time. In this silence, doubt grew louder, and the priests watched for every flicker of uncertainty. They wanted disciples who would cling to the rituals for meaning, who would see the priests not as leaders, but as the only conduit to survival. They taught the disciples to fast for long periods, insisting that hunger opened spiritual channels. They subjected them to extreme temperatures, from cold stone chambers at dawn to blistering courtyards at midday. Each exercise was disguised as spiritual preparation, but its true purpose was to erode resistance. A disciple weakened by hunger and exhaustion became more pliable, more willing to believe in the priest's interpretations of visions, omens, and inner turmoil. And always, hovering at the edge of this training, was the unspoken fear. Failing a single step could mark you as spiritually corrupt, a danger to the balance the priests claimed to protect. By the time the disciples were led toward the hidden chambers where the real rituals occurred, their minds were already stretched thin. They no longer trusted their own instincts. They trusted only what the priests whispered in the dim hallways. The selection had never been about preparing them for enlightenment. It had been about crafting obedience so complete that the upcoming trials would feel not like punishment, but like destiny. And as they approached the threshold of the first true ritual, many felt something unsettling rising within them, a sense that the priests were not testing their devotion, but waiting for the inevitable moment when one of them would falter, revealing a weakness the priests claimed to see, long before the disciples ever stepped into the sacred dark. The first true initiation ritual was never announced. The disciples were awakened without warning, often dragged from uneasy dreams by the sound of conch shells echoing through the compound. Their bodies were still weak from fasting, their minds fogged from days of silence, and that disorientation was intentional. The priests wanted their thoughts to blur, their sense of time to fracture, so that the ritual would strike not only the body, but the very core of their identity. As they were led through narrow stone corridors, torchlight flickered across their faces, revealing expressions trapped somewhere between anticipation and dread. The walls around them seemed to pulse with the ghostly residue of those who had walked this path before, leaving behind only whispers that scraped at the edges of hearing. When the disciples entered the ritual chamber, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. This was no ceremonial hall meant for public rites. The air was thick with incense and something far more unsettling, a metallic tang that clung to the skin. The chamber was circular, its walls covered in carvings depicting gods with gaping mouths, serpents coiling around human figures, and priests bent over kneeling initiates. In the center burned a low fire that seemed to absorb rather than illuminate its surroundings. The priests waited there, unmoving, their feathered headdresses swaying slightly as if stirred by an unseen wind. Their faces were masked except for their eyes, which followed every step with predatory calm. The disciples were instructed to kneel, to place their hands over their hearts, and to regulate their breath according to a rhythm tapped out by an elder priest striking a hollowed skull drum. The ritual was meant to test their alignment with the gods, but beneath the spiritual language lay something more human and far darker. The priests watched for any tremor, any hesitation, any faltering breath that might betray fear or impurity. The failure of even a single sequence was interpreted as a fracture in the disciples' spiritual integrity, a sign that their essence was unfit for the higher mysteries. Then came the ordeal of the obsidian mirrors. The priests positioned polished black stones before each disciple, forcing them to stare into reflective darkness. The mirrors did not show their faces clearly. Instead, they distorted the features, stretching expressions into shapes that seemed almost alive. The disciples were to focus on the shifting reflections and recite invocations meant to steady the mind. But for many, the experience dissolved quickly into confusion. Hours could pass in this state, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the priests' murmured chants. Some disciples reported seeing their reflections blink independently, whispering warnings or revealing weaknesses the priests would later exploit. Next, they were required to walk a narrow path of heated stones, each step calibrated to test pain, tolerance, and devotion. The path was not long, but the intensity of the heat forced the mind to confront itself. Those who cried out or hesitated were noted, their names whispered among the priests as potential failures. And for those who faltered midway, overcome by fear or dizziness, the consequences began long before the ritual was officially declared failed. The priests' eyes would harden, their chants would shift in tone, and the atmosphere of the chamber thickened with a sense of impending judgment. By the end of the initiation, the disciples who remained standing were trembling, drenched in sweat, and unable to distinguish spiritual revelation from psychological collapse. Yet the priests offered no comfort, no praise. They simply observed, marking who had endured and who had fractured. The disciples understood then that this ritual was not a test of enlightenment, but a weapon designed to expose weakness with merciless clarity, preparing the priests for what they intended to do next. The moment a disciple faltered, even slightly, the priests shifted into a different state, one colder, more deliberate, as if the failure they had been waiting for had finally revealed itself. Among the Maya priesthood, a failed ritual was not interpreted as simple weakness. It was believed to be a contamination of spiritual essence, a rupture that threatened the delicate balance between the mortal world and the realms of gods and ancestors. The priests moved with precision, their movements as synchronized as the stars they charted, surrounding the failed disciple without raising their voices or showing any outward sign of emotion. What came next was never spoken of openly, even among the highest ranks of the clergy. The failed disciple was taken from the ritual chamber through a narrow passageway that curved downward, growing colder with each step. The air smelled different there, earthier, metallic, as if saturated with memories. These passages led to the Chamber of Severance, a hidden space beneath the temple where the most feared rites were carried out. The priests called it a place of purification, but the oracles whispered that it was a chamber where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, where spirits lost themselves and human minds unraveled. The disciple, already shaken by failure, was led into a room illuminated only by the faint, wavering glow of resin-burning bowls. Shadows crawled up the walls, like living creatures. Inside this chamber stood 3 elder priests, and, sitting apart, a single oracle draped in woven crimson cloth. The disciples had always believed the oracles were the most serene figures in Maya society, but in this chamber, their composure fractured. The oracles were said to see beyond the physical world, to witness threads of fate and echoes of past lives. Yet even they struggled to look directly at a failed disciple. Some turned their faces away. Others whispered prayers beneath their breath. To them, the failure was not merely a sign of spiritual weakness, it was a distortion so profound that it unsettled their vision, like a dark stain spreading through sacred water. The punishments imposed by the priests were not rooted in cruelty for its own sake. They believed they were correcting a cosmic imbalance. The disciple was made to kneel before the obsidian basin, a bowl filled not with water, but with a thick, dark liquid symbolizing the severing of misaligned energy. The priests began chanting, their voices low and rhythmic, creating a pulse that reverberated through the chamber. The failed disciples' hands were placed against the basin's rim, and the cold stone forced them to confront their reflection, distorted in the liquid, an image fractured, fragmented, no longer entirely human. As the chanting intensified, the disciple underwent a ritual meant to strip away the part of their spirit deemed corrupted. This was not a physical mutilation, though many would prefer that to what truly happened. The priests used carved jade blades not to cut flesh, but to trace patterns across the disciple's skin, patterns believed to draw out the failure itself, to expose it to the gods. Each stroke burned like fire, leaving marks that felt deeper than skin. The oracles trembled as they watched, some shielding their eyes from the final moment when the priests pressed the carved stone into the disciples' sternum, forcing them to confront the internal fracture that the ritual sought to cleanse. What emerged from this chamber was not the same person who had entered. Whether they were allowed to return to their duties or sent into silence depended solely on what the priests claimed to see in the ritual's final moment. And though the oracles feared the process, they never intervened. They understood better than anyone that the priesthood believed these punishments were all that stood between order and spiritual collapse. The earlier disciples who survived carried an invisible weight, a mark felt far more than seen, and the rest, those who could not endure, simply disappeared from the records, leaving behind only the echo of their failure in the dim corridors of the temple. If this part of the story triggered a reaction in you, tell me what struck you the most. Leave a comment sharing what element of these forgotten punishments you found the most unsettling. Your insight helps keep these hidden histories alive as we continue deeper into what the ancient priests left behind. Beneath the surface of the temple, hidden from even the most curious acolytes, lay the chambers where the Maya priests conducted their most guarded rituals. These underground halls were carved into limestone, their ceilings low and walls etched with glyphs depicting cosmic battles and the fates of those who failed to honor the gods. The air was dense and damp, carrying a faint, metallic tang that clung to the skin as if the stone itself had absorbed centuries of ritualized fear. Disciples who had survived the initial tests were led through narrow corridors, the echo of their footsteps swallowed by the architecture, until they reached rooms that seemed alive, vibrating with energy no mortal eye could see. Each chamber had a specific purpose, meticulously designed to test and manipulate the spirit. Some rooms forced initiates to confront illusions, conjured by polished obsidian surfaces reflecting distorted images of themselves. Others presented the disciples with sounds and whispers recorded over decades, voices of past failures repeating their mistakes endlessly. The priests believed that by confronting these echoes, the mind could be purged of impurity, reshaped to align perfectly with cosmic order. Yet these trials were not abstract. The chambers were engineered to exact physical responses. Hot stones, frigid water, and narrow ledges tested balance, endurance, and courage, all while the mind reeled from the overwhelming sensory input. Central to these hidden spaces was the Chamber of Shadows, where light and darkness merged, creating an environment in which even the most disciplined disciples felt disoriented. In this space, the priests could observe every micro-reaction, every twitch, every shiver, every flicker of hesitation, as an indicator of spiritual alignment. It was a place where the line between ritual and punishment blurred. The priests did not strike or shout. Their presence alone, coupled with the oppressive architecture, was enough to push disciples to the brink of psychological unraveling. Each breath became a test, each heartbeat a challenge to maintain composure under scrutiny that was both constant and invisible. Other chambers served more symbolic functions. The Hall of Echoes was lined with alcoves containing relics of previous disciples, tools, tokens, and personal items intended to confront the initiate with the inevitability of failure. Some objects were broken, some burned, and some carefully preserved as a warning. Survival was not guaranteed, and obedience was absolute. Every chamber communicated a singular truth. Power was inseparable from submission, and the priests held dominion over both. Disciples internalized this message, their fear mingling with awe, forming a complex respect for the ritual hierarchy that would govern their actions for years to come. By the time an initiate reached the final hidden chamber, their body and mind had been conditioned. They moved automatically, responding to instructions that had once seemed impossible to obey. The chambers themselves were a teacher, the priests facilitators of an education that balanced on the razor's edge between enlightenment and destruction. The disciples were expected to carry the memory of these experiences with them, for the lessons were not temporary. They were meant to mark the soul, ensuring that even after leaving the subterranean confines, the power of the priests' training remained, shaping behavior, loyalty, and faith. The temples and their hidden chambers were not merely sacred spaces. They were instruments of control, precision forged to create disciples who would never question their place in the cosmic hierarchy. By the time the disciples emerged from the hidden chambers, the oracles had already begun their own examinations. These seers, revered for their ability to interpret the will of the gods, held a position that was both respected and feared. They were not present during the physical trials, yet their judgments carried immense weight, shaping the disciples' futures in ways even the priests could not dictate. The oracles listened to the subtle tremors in a disciple's voice, watched the flicker of emotion in their eyes, and sensed the lingering traces of failure still clinging to their spirit. The moment a disciple stepped into their presence, they were measured not only by action, but by essence, a judgment that reached far beyond human comprehension. Failure before the oracles was considered a cosmic disruption. Unlike the rituals that tested endurance and obedience, the oracles evaluated alignment with the spiritual order itself. Even a single misstep in concentration or a wavering heartbeat could be interpreted as a fracture in one's spiritual integrity. Whispers of past initiates who had faltered in this phase echoed through the corridors, their fates serving as both warning and lesson. Those who failed were often sent into silence for months, sometimes years, their voices muted, their spiritual presence considered dangerous to the collective balance. It was an existence of perpetual observation, a limbo designed to allow reflection while preventing influence over others, maintaining the sanctity of the cosmic equilibrium. The oracles themselves were not immune to fear. They perceived the consequences of failure in ways that transcended physical suffering. In their visions, A faltering disciple could invite imbalance not just into the human realm, but into the spiritual continuum that connected gods, ancestors, and mortals. The risk of allowing weakness to propagate, even unknowingly, was intolerable. For this reason, oracles would sometimes signal the priests to extend certain trials, to intensify meditation, fasting, or exposure to ritualized fear, ensuring that only those capable of withstanding both physical and spiritual pressure could advance. The disciples, aware or unaware of this unseen scrutiny, felt the weight of a presence that watched them for every subtle flaw, every fleeting doubt. Some disciples experienced this stage as an internal battle, grappling with doubt, fear, and fragmented memories of earlier failures. Others reported visions, ghostly impressions of ancestors or divine entities emerging to judge, guide, or terrify them. In these moments, the line between reality and the spiritual dimension blurred, leaving initiates questioning not only their own resolve, but the very fabric of existence. The oracle's assessment was both invisible and absolute, shaping behavior with authority that surpassed any punishment inflicted by mortal hands. For those who endured, the experience created a profound awareness. Spiritual survival required total alignment, a unity of mind, body, and soul in accordance with the cosmic order dictated by the priesthood and interpreted by the oracles. The fear instilled by the oracles was subtle, yet pervasive. It did not manifest as a single act of cruelty, but as an ongoing, silent pressure that reinforced obedience and reverence. A disciple who had faltered once might regain composure, but the memory of that scrutiny lingered indefinitely, shaping every thought and action. In this way, the oracles maintained not just control, but a pervasive influence that extended beyond the chamber walls into the hearts and minds of those who had survived the trials. The knowledge that failure could ripple across realms imbued each disciple with a careful, almost trembling respect for the unseen forces they served, ensuring that the balance the priests and oracles guarded remained unbroken. For those disciples who survived both the chambers and the scrutiny of the oracles, the transformation was profound and unsettling. It was not merely physical endurance or obedience that marked their survival. It was the subtle reshaping of the mind, the spirit, and even perception itself. By the time they were allowed to return to the surface, they moved differently, spoke differently, and thought differently. Their very presence carried the weight of the trials they had endured, a quiet authority earned through suffering that the priests and oracles could see reflected in their eyes. Each step they took was measured, deliberate, as if the world itself had shifted beneath them, forcing them to navigate with heightened awareness. The process left an indelible mark. Many disciples reported seeing patterns where none existed, hearing voices in silence, feeling the pulse of the temple as if it were part of their own heartbeat. They became attuned to the rhythms of ritual, the subtle gestures of priests, the cadence of chants, and even the placement of ceremonial objects. These senses, honed under pressure and fear, allowed them to anticipate the priesthood's intentions and navigate the complexities of sacred space with almost instinctive precision. The transformation was both a gift and a burden, granting insight while binding them to the invisible chains of obedience and vigilance. Psychological change was equally profound. The disciples learned to compartmentalize fear, to convert hesitation into strategic compliance, and to endure mental strain without visible faltering. Their memories of failure and punishment became tools, internalized warnings that guided every decision. Where once a trembling thought might have caused hesitation, it now became a signal, a method of calculating the risks of exposure or disobedience. This psychological conditioning was subtle, invisible to the casual observer, yet it ensured that the disciples remained fully aligned with the priesthood's demands. Even outside the temples, the lessons of the trials shaped behavior, speech, and thought, reinforcing the absolute hierarchy of spiritual authority. Physical endurance was also affected. Muscles strengthened under repetitive ritual movement, posture aligned with ceremonial form, and the body itself became a vessel for the disciplined mind. Yet these marks were not visible to the untrained eye. A survivor might appear ordinary, yet every gesture, every breath, carried the echo of chambers and punishments endured. The most subtle sign of faltering was enough for priests or oracles to perceive vulnerability, making invisibility in obedience a lifelong necessity. Those who failed to maintain this vigilance risked the memory of past failures returning as punishment or exclusion from sacred rites. By the time the transformed disciples returned to the broader temple life, they were both revered and feared. Their peers sensed an unspoken authority in their gaze, a quiet power shaped by endurance and secret knowledge. But the weight of survival also isolated them. They could not speak of what they had endured, for language itself could never fully capture the spiritual and psychological trials. The priests understood that silence was necessary, and the disciples obeyed. Yet that silence became a living presence, a reminder that the failures they had witnessed, or themselves embodied, remained close, haunting the corners of perception. Now, if you were in their place, could you survive such transformations? Could your mind, body, and spirit endure the invisible pressures of this hidden hierarchy? Comment below what you think would be the hardest part to survive. Your insight shapes the understanding of these ancient, terrifying trials and keeps this hidden history alive. The power wielded by the Maya priesthood was inseparable from the fear they cultivated. The transformation of disciples into disciplined, obedient instruments was only part of a larger system of control designed to maintain dominance over the broader community. The priests understood that their authority was not simply spiritual, it was political, social, and psychological. The ceremonies, punishments, and secret chambers were all tools to ensure that each disciple internalized the hierarchy, carrying its influence into every corner of daily life. Fear was both protective and coercive, creating a society in which even the slightest deviation from the prescribed spiritual path was unthinkable. Control extended beyond the temple walls. Disciples who had endured the trials became conduits of the priesthood's authority, reinforcing order within the city and among other initiates. Their presence reminded others that the priest's scrutiny was invisible, yet ever present. People whispered of what happened to those who failed, and even the most curious refrained from questioning sacred authority. Stories of disappearance, punishment, or transformation circulated as cautionary tales, ensuring compliance without the need for constant supervision. In this way, the priesthood wielded both fear and awe, a combination far more effective than any overt coercion. The intertwining of sacrifice and power was central to maintaining this hierarchy. Rituals often involved offerings, sometimes symbolic, sometimes literal, that reinforced the priest's control over life, death, and cosmic balance. Disciples learned early that the consequences of disobedience were not abstract. They were tangible and immediate. The knowledge that the priests could manipulate both the spiritual and physical realms reinforced the necessity of obedience. It was not only the fear of punishment, but the understanding that the cosmic order itself depended on their compliance. Every action, every word, every Expression became an extension of the system, a performance in alignment with the priesthood's expectations. The priests also leveraged secrecy as a mechanism of control. Knowledge of the rituals was carefully segmented, shared only with those deemed sufficiently prepared and trustworthy. Disciples were taught that what they learned was not merely sacred but dangerous. Sharing it recklessly could destabilize the delicate balance the priests maintained. This secrecy created a hierarchy within a hierarchy where disciples themselves became custodians of forbidden knowledge. Their understanding of power, authority, and spiritual alignment was both a privilege and a burden, binding them to the priesthood in ways that extended far beyond formal ceremony. Every aspect of the system was designed to merge fear, obedience, and reverence into a cohesive framework of power. The discipline instilled through trials, the constant awareness of oracular scrutiny, and the isolation of secret chambers all contributed to a society in which the priesthood maintained absolute dominance. The survivors of punishment carried the weight of this system into every interaction, reinforcing the authority of the priests and perpetuating a cycle of control that extended through generations. Through this careful orchestration, the Maya priests were not simply spiritual leaders. They were architects of a society structured around obedience, fear, and the subtle, enduring influence of those who had endured and survived their darkest rituals. Despite the meticulous records kept by the Maya priests, much of what occurred within the hidden chambers has been lost to time. Many codices, once repositories of sacred knowledge and accounts of disciples' trials, were destroyed or deliberately concealed to prevent outsiders from understanding the full extent of these practices. The priests recognized that secrecy preserved power. The fewer who knew the truth, the more control they could maintain over both initiates and the broader population. Oral traditions carried fragments of these events, but even then, storytellers often disguised the true nature of failures and punishments in metaphor or allegory, leaving only shadows of what truly happened. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into this hidden world, but it is incomplete. Sites reveal subterranean chambers, ceremonial artifacts, and glyphs depicting initiation and punishment, yet their meanings remain partially obscured. Scholars speculate about the experiences of disciples, piecing together the intended psychological and spiritual effects of rituals from these remnants. Even so, the silent testimonies of the structures speak volumes. Corridors designed to disorient, altars arranged to focus attention and energy, and hidden passages that forced contemplation of both fear and reverence. Each fragment hints at a complex system intended to shape behavior, consciousness, and loyalty long after the rituals concluded. The traditions themselves were not uniform across regions. Variations in practice depended on local priesthoods, available resources, and the specific deities worshipped. Yet the underlying principles remained constant: discipline through fear, alignment with cosmic order, and the absolute authority of the clergy. Even when codices were destroyed, these principles persisted, embedded in the social and spiritual frameworks of Maya society. The surviving disciples became living vessels of this knowledge, transmitting lessons through subtle gestures, conduct, and instruction to new initiates. The rituals and their consequences were embedded in memory, in habit, and in the very way individuals navigated communal life. Many of the disciples who survived carried marks not visible to outsiders, symbols burned into their skin through ceremonial contact, scars earned through endurance, and psychological imprints that guided their actions and decisions. These invisible markers functioned as both badge and warning, a testament to the intense pressures faced and overcome. For outsiders, these individuals appeared ordinary, yet they embodied an intimate understanding of the consequences of failure, a constant reminder of the disciplined hierarchy that governed spiritual and social life. In this way, the memory of failure was preserved not in text, but in the living behavior and careful adherence to ritual structure. Even centuries later, the legacy of these hidden practices can be traced in the echoes of surviving temples, in fragments of codices, and in the oral traditions that persisted despite colonial suppression. Scholars and archaeologists uncovering these sites often note the deliberate concealment of chambers and the precision with which spaces were constructed to control perception, movement, and emotion. It is a haunting reminder that the history of the Maya priesthood is layered, multifaceted, and deliberately obfuscated. What remains is a complex interplay between memory, suppression, and survival, an enduring testament to a system designed to shape disciples, enforce obedience, and ensure that the power of the priesthood extended far beyond the visible, into the very psyche of those who lived under its influence. As the disciples grew in experience and endured trial after trial, the true impact of the priesthood's methods became evident. Those who survived were not merely trained, they were transformed into living extensions of the temples themselves, vessels of knowledge, obedience, and subtle terror. They moved through the community carrying both reverence and fear, embodying the lessons learned in shadowed chambers and whispered corridors. Their presence reminded others of the invisible authority that shaped every action and decision, enforcing a hierarchy that extended far beyond the rituals themselves. Yet for all the discipline instilled, there was an undeniable tension between survival and the lingering memories of failure. The echoes of those who could not endure haunted the corridors, etched into the minds of survivors, a constant reminder of what failure truly meant. The legacy of these disciples, however, was not just personal. The control exerted through fear, endurance, and secret knowledge ensured that the priesthood maintained influence over generations. Their rituals were not confined to moments of ceremony. They permeated daily life, shaping social interactions, spiritual beliefs, and political hierarchies. Survivors became guardians of forbidden knowledge, enforcers of subtle authority, and teachers of the unwritten rules that preserved the cosmic balance the priests claimed to protect. In this way, the priesthood ensured that their power persisted long after the initial trials, embedding obedience and reverence into the very fabric of society. And yet, the consequences of failure were never fully erased. The disappeared disciples, those who faltered and vanished from the records, served as a spectral warning to all who followed. Their absence spoke louder than any words, reminding the living that the line between survival and oblivion was razor-thin. The priests used this unseen legacy to instill a quiet, pervasive obedience, ensuring that the power of ritual extended far beyond the chamber walls. Each initiation, each trial, each observation by the oracles reinforced a system where knowledge, fear, and cosmic order were inseparable, binding both spirit and mind to the authority of the temple. Now, after witnessing the hidden mechanisms of control, endurance, and transformation, it is your turn to reflect. If you have followed this journey to the end, consider leaving a comment with your thoughts, perhaps something like, "I can't imagine surviving that," or "This changed how I see ancient rituals." Your perspective matters and shows that you endured the story as the disciples endured their trials. Remember to like the video if this deep dive into hidden history resonates with you, and check if you're subscribed to ensure you continue uncovering these forgotten truths. And finally, there's a next video waiting that will expand even further on the mysteries of ancient spiritual hierarchies. Click and continue this journey with us, because the story doesn't end here, and the shadows of the past still have lessons to reveal.